Welcome back. We're talking about the possible marginalization of the Muslim Brotherhood as some U.S. lawmakers back legislation to classify the group as a terrorist organization. Still with me, Ebrahim Rasool is the former South African ambassador to the United States. Sahar Khamis is a communications professor at the University of Maryland. And Nader Hashemi is director of the University of Denver's Center for Middle East Studies. And let's go to Nader Hashemi. Nader, is there a division in the United States on this action that is proposed by people like Ted Cruz and his supporters? I mean, as you pointed out, these are people on the fringes of the Republican Party as well. What happens in a situation like this? Because we know that the legislation that they are proposing doesn't actually label the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, but it tells the State Department that they meet the criteria to be called a terrorist organization. Why aren't you doing anything about it?
You're right. I mean, there is some pushback. I mean, the State Department, at least under Secretary of State John Kerry and under the Obama administration, are not going to fall for this argument that the Muslim Brotherhood is an alleged terrorist organization. I mean, the claim really is ridiculous. It's in fact turning politics, not only upside down, but inside out. It's the Sisi regime that has been practicing a lot of terror since it came to power, 3 years ago. But there is some, pushback, but I don't think it's right to say that this is coming from the fringes of the Republican Party. I mean, Ted Cruz is number 2 in the Republican Party, primary right now, and there's a good chance that if it goes to a brokered convention, that he might be the presidential candidate in the upcoming election. So this is not the fringes. This is very much within the mainstream of the Republican Party, and these ideas, as I said before, are being supported by various influential lobby groups. And these ideas are being promoted by mainstream news organizations like Fox News. And so they do sink deep roots within the political culture, and there's not a lot of pushback. So when Ted Cruz, for example, was challenged just a few days ago by Wolf Blitzer for his affiliation with extreme Islamophobes like Frank Gaffney, why does he have that person as a foreign policy advisor? Ted Cruz really didn't give a good answer, and Wolf Blitzer sort of just dropped the ball, and it was perfectly sort of acceptable for Ted Cruz to sort of engage in this type of Islamophobic discourse, and mainstream reporters in the United States simply don't have, I think, the sufficient background or at least courage to push back against these types of narratives. So this is a very mainstream problem. It can't be and shouldn't be relegated to the extreme fringes of the American political spectrum.
I want to comment on what Ambassador Rasool said about, the support to dictators in the Arab world. This is a very important point. When, before Mubarak was deposed from office, and when the 2011 revolution erupted in Egypt, there was an interview with some of the young revolutionary activists and, the leaders of the, grassroots revolution, and they were asked, what do you expect from the United States? And they said, we just only have one single request. Please stop supporting Mubarak. Please stop supporting dictators in this part of the world. We were very much hoping that with the eruption of the Arab Spring, we're going to see a change in U.S. foreign policy in the region, which unfortunately did not happen to be the case. Unfortunately, we see same old fashion of let's support dictators in power in the hope of maintaining stability, while in fact we can never have true stability when you have dictatorship and when you have coercion and when you don't have sufficient freedom of expression. So that's a lesson that I think the U.S. government has not learned up till this moment in time.
All right. Ambassador, is this a case of the United States acting on its own here? Is it an isolated extremist policy? Or does it perhaps have support in other countries, among its allies, for instance, in Western Europe? Because we know that in the past, allies in Europe have just marched in lockstep with the United States when it comes to foreign policy in the Middle East.
I think that the United States is probably the one power that if it speaks or if it acts, actually has the overwhelming force to enforce its will. That when it calls the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, that Europe will follow fairly meekly, and the United States will have the capacity to enact that legislation and to act against the Muslim Brotherhood, something which other countries may not necessarily have. But I'm not so worried about whether the US is in lockstep with Europe. I think it is that the US will be in lockstep with the dictators of the Middle East. Everyone sees ISIS as a clear and present danger, but very few people have actually acted with resources and with will to destroy ISIS, even though we know where they are located in Syria and Iraq. But every proxy in the Middle East are busy fighting their favorite enemies. And so one country hates Shias and calls them terrorists and then wages an entire war in another country. Another group says, the Muslim Brotherhood is my enemy. If I call them a terrorist, then I can unleash the same kind of force that people expect me to unleash against ISIS. And another country says, I'm dealing with my opposition. If I call them terrorists, then I can barrel bomb them and get rid of them as we would with ISIS. And so what is happening here is really a perversion of the definition of terrorism, a perversion of the definition of extremism, the loss of nuance in understanding the Muslim world, and the compounding of errors that will make that part of the world the production factory, the manufacturing base for extremists that will haunt us for decades to come, as has been the case in nurturing extremists in Afghanistan in the early 1980s.
Right, Nader, tell us more about the Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, to some extent, it is an organization that's already been demonized in the media, especially here in the United States. You know, we see labels like terrorists, radicals, extremists, etc. They do have considerable appeal in Egypt.
Well, that's true. They have considerable appeal in Egypt, although when they assumed political power, they lost a lot of appeal because of their poor record of governance. But generally speaking, I think they represent a significant portion of the electorate in Egypt and in other Muslim-majority Arab countries. They did have, I think, a past that suggests that they were not committed to the ideals of democracy, but that was decades ago. By and large, the mainstream Muslim Brotherhood movements across the Arab world are committed to electoral politics, are committed to nonviolent change. And sadly, the same thing can't be said for their adversaries who are in power. I mean, the ruling regimes that rule over populations in Egypt, for example, are not committed to peaceful, negotiated, nonviolent politics. They're committed to the antithesis of this, and that you know, is important to remember. The context in which the Muslim Brotherhood operates in Egypt or in other Arab countries is an authoritarian context where you have repressive state regimes that violate human rights, that practice torture routinely, and don't respect electoral outcomes. And so I think that's the fundamental backdrop that is often forgotten when we talk about the Muslim Brotherhood. They're put under a magnifying glass and they're scrutinized, but the same scrutiny is not directed to the authoritarian regimes who are in power and who are guilty of far greater violations of human rights and democratic norms than anything that can be attributed to it.
Important points I'd like to highlight here. Number one, context of the last remarks. Inside Egypt and within the Arab world, there has been a very interesting paradox about Muslim Brotherhood. Why the at the same time having a very wide base of support at the grassroots level, and there are reasons for that. When you have, economically challenged countries where 40% or more of the population lives under the international poverty line, if you provide services, if you provide good clothing and subsidized food and support and medical clinics and so on at a very reasonable cost, you will have popularity. And Egyptians and many Arabs are also religious people, whether they're Christian or Muslim. They're religious people by nature, so they lean towards religious sentiment and religious rhetoric. So it has been always a paradox and anomaly to see this crackdown and banning from the regimes in power, but the growing base of popularity and support at the grassroots level. Let me, however, highlight something which is very important, which is, they're now, agreeing to electoral democracy and all that stuff, but I think that they still have room for improvement. I'm talking about the Muslim Brotherhood here and other groups. They need to have room for improvement in terms of widening the prospect of participatory democracy within their own ranks. In other words, having less centralization of decision-making and more participatory decision-making within the ranks of the Brotherhood itself. That's a room for improvement.
Okay, that's where we have to leave it. Sahar Khamis, Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, Nader Hashemi, thanks to all of you for joining us.
Thank you.